Thank you so much to the worship team. Thank you, Keith, for leading us. And Kevin and Kay, thank you for welcoming us at the door this morning. Getting to chapter 21 of the book of Acts in the series. It doesn't feel like that long that we've been in it, but it also feels long. It's one of those things that it's neither long nor short. It's medium. We get into that part in the book of Acts, the story where Paul arrives in Jerusalem and the ministry takes on a completely different form. No longer is he going to be going out to plant churches or to encourage churches. It now becomes a case of the gospel is now on trial. And with it being on trial, so it's going to be, in a sense, assessed and tested through the various levels of government until eventually Paul appeals to Caesar. And we now take that journey. And so even the sermons now will adjust and change as we look at a different aspect of what happened with Paul. So the sermon this morning is entitled, Misunderstanding the Gospel is not an excuse for a riot. So you'll notice the painting in the background there was more of a sketch by Philip Gull called The Arrest of St. Paul. It used to be housed in the National Gallery of Washington, D.C. It's now in our house, along with many other famous paintings. Took a snapshot of that to put it as the background. Now that you all know that we have it, please don't tell anybody. So let me start off with just helping us to understand misunderstandings. I think we've all been through cases of misunderstandings, but gross misunderstandings can actually be at times embarrassing, and at times can also cause massive problems. Richard Mead, he was a very well-known physician in the early to middle of the 18th century. He was very well known because he was the Queen's personal physician. He was a personal physician for Isaac Newton. He attended Isaac Newton on his deathbed. Several other very important people. There's a picture of him. You can see big hair, importance. Keep that in mind. Big hair, importance. Dr. Mead dealt a lot with in the treatment of certain exotic diseases, and particular one, diseases of the gut. And he discovered a treatment that was being used by the American Indian, was that the introduction of tobacco smoke into the gut would help to ease the pain. How they did that was administered through the rectum. Anyway, several decades later, along came... let me just say that Richard Mead was buried in Westminster Abbey. You have to be famous. There's a picture of his bust. This is the next picture coming up. You can see he's had a haircut. He was no longer important. Now we get to two doctors, one a pharmacist and one a physician. William Hawes, he's on the that side. He's looking at the camera. He's the pharmacist. He's not embarrassed. Thomas Cogan, he's looking away. Well, he's looking at William. He's embarrassed. That's his good side. He was the physician. They formed an institution called the Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned. I don't know how you go. They apparently drowned. Well, they formed this institute on the 18th of April in 1774 at the Chapter Coffee House, happened over coffee, at St. Paul's Churchyard. They believed that the body had to be kept in balance with the four humours. Humour me with this for a moment. It was blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If these were kept in perfect harmony, the body was in good health. If a person drowned, or apparently drowned, as they would put it, apparently drowned, they believed that what it was that the phlegm was now wet. I didn't realize that phlegm could be dry, but anyway, the phlegm was wet, and the black bile was cold. So you had to dry out the phlegm, that's an antihistamine, and warm up the black bile. So they employed Richard Mead's technique. The offending instrument will now be placed. There we go, that's the instrument that was used. It was positioned strategically along the Thames. In instances of where people fell off a boat and apparently drowned, they could be pulled out the water and resuscitation effected, with the removing of the person's undergarments and blowing tobacco into the rectum, and such causing the heart to suddenly restart. Especially when the odd offending ember also entered. Fortunately, in the 1950s, they realized that blowing through the mouth actually helped better. You can see how misunderstandings just end in a really bad way. And this was regarded for several decades as the correct way to resuscitate a person. From that also has come the saying, such as blowing smoke up. I'm not going to say any further. Let's turn to more serious things. Acts 21, verse 28. In this whole scenario that's happening, you have a moment where they want to arrest Paul. And there's a group of Israelites who start problems. And the crowd, just in this one verse, verse 28, and I encourage you to go and read the whole of chapter 21. Fellow Israelites, help us. They've grabbed hold of Paul. This is the man who teaches everyone against our people, our law, and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. So this group makes 4 accusations. And they are important accusations because they tell us a lot about what the mind was back then, and it tells us a lot about the accusations that could, in a sense, be leveled at the church today. The first one is that they were obsessed with the importance of their nation over against what God was saying. The second thing is that they had misinterpreted the law of Moses. The third thing, they had misinterpreted the temple and its purposes. And the fourth thing, they had misunderstood that they were to be a light to the Gentiles. One thing we must understand about the mentality of a mob, and coming from South Africa, where we see lots of riots and mobs, you begin to realize that when a mob gathers for some kind of riot, the majority of people don't know why they are there. Usually those who have organized, and that's a handful of people, are the ones who prey off the ignorance of the rest of the mob, and they simply employ the presence of this mob to try to get their point across. And so what you'll find is that when a particular government begins to realize that mob mentality doesn't necessarily work, they don't listen to the mob any longer. Except in South Africa, what they do is that when they're not listened to, they just go and loot all the shops. And then the government starts to listen, so in order not to let the shops get looted. But we see this kind of mob mentality happening in Jerusalem. 21 verses 30 through to 36. Let's listen what is said. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. This is classic mob. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, obviously he was really tough while they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in uproar. You can see this is a massive mob. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his officers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd shouted one thing and some another. You can see typical mob. And since the commander could not get to the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that were following kept shouting, "Get rid of him." It was they'd been whipped up into this frenzy by the small group of people who had misunderstood. Now, this kind of antagonism that was happening, and the pushing of this agenda that they had. We're going to look at these misunderstandings and the errors that they made. And as we take careful note of them, we'll also note that there are errors that we make. And at times, these are the same errors that we can make. And that we can pass on a wrong gospel to our friends, to our family, to our community, to our nation. So let's look at this. How do we do this? First of all, Christians must always be ready to give a correct answer to the gospel. Not to our hobby horses, but to the gospel. And it must be a credible answer, and a Christian must be careful not to commit intellectual suicide. Very often we do that. We commit intellectual suicide. We've got to watch the statements we make. We must ensure that they line up with the full counsel of Scripture. Many Muslims and atheists I have met know Scripture better than many Christians sitting in churches. I remember having a debate with some Muslims when we were doing Muslim evangelism up in North Africa or West Africa. Chatting to some of the imams. The imams were illiterate. They'd never read the Quran. Didn't even know what was in the Quran. I had studied the Quran. Done a master's course in studying the Quran. I knew it very well. The one thing I realized is that I had wasted my time because none of them knew what was in the Quran, so I couldn't debate with them. But the one thing they knew the Bible. They could argue with me on the Bible. And we must never take for granted that the people out there who say, I don't follow God, do not know Scripture. And the moment we start to manipulate Scripture and start to make it into something that we want it to be and not what the gospel is, they spot you from a mile away, and we become the stumbling block for why they will never enter a church. Because they will say, the people in the church don't even know their own gospel. Why do I even want to go there? Do you know the gospel? Do you really know it? I mean, from Old Testament through to New, can you track it? See, there's no excuse in any church for any Christian to not know the gospel and to keep it as a priority. The world is watching. The world is that field white unto harvest. But when the church is ready to preach the gospel, the world will come. Jesus, when he sent out the disciples, he had this to say to them. This comes from Matthew chapter 10. I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. This is a statement of saying, don't commit intellectual suicide. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to Gentiles. And when they arrest you, do not worry about what you say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of my Father speaking through you. So the first thing this error that they made, the importance of the nation over and above God. No nation on this planet is more important than the one who created it. No nation. And you and I should never at any stage elevate one nation above another at the expense of the gospel. Every nation has been strategically placed there by God for a purpose. When I make a nation more important than another, when I place them at such a place that they begin to usurp the gospel, I'm committing the same error that they were. It is about God. He's the creator of every single people group on this planet. Every single one of them. And when Jesus went to the cross, he went to the cross for every single nation, for every single person in those nations. And I can never at any stage begin to elevate anybody else. It is God who's the one who is elevated. And to him alone do we give glory. They misunderstood the Old Testament in its entirety when we talk about the law of Moses. The law of Moses often was used as a statement to talk about the entire Old Testament. They misunderstood it. Right in the beginning, in Genesis, you get the gospel. All the way through to Malachi, you get the gospel. Always. Throughout the Old Testament, there is the gospel. In Genesis, the entry of sin into the world, right at that moment, the gospel is presented. When God finds Adam and Eve, he gives them the promise of the Messiah. There's the gospel. They must have understood that. The Abrahamic covenant. When God said to Abraham, I will bless you and you will be a blessing. The question is that, is the church a blessing to the world? Or is the church a confusion to the world? Remember that moment when God said to Abraham to take the animals and to split them in two. And I've spoken about this as being that scarlet road where God moved through that scarlet road for Abraham. Becoming known as the Abrahamic covenant. It was all about the gospel. When the law was given to Moses, It was all about a sacrificial system that was a foreshadow of the Messiah to come. It was about that the law was given to show us why we're going to need Jesus. It was all about the gospel. When you get throughout the story of the nation of Israel, and the times that, there were a few times that Israel succeeded, but the majority of the time they messed up. But every time the prophets called them back, it was about the gospel. See, they had taken this and totally misunderstanding it. They were now setting the nation up for failure. That's how dangerous their statement was. They were setting their nation up for failure. They were presenting themselves simply as experts of misunderstanding. Experts of misunderstanding. They totally misunderstood what Paul had been doing, misunderstood the gospel, and further they were claiming that they had the authority to interpret that the Torah or the whole law of Moses did not talk about the gospel. This is a dangerous place for them to be in. Such a dangerous place. That in a sense, when we read just that one verse about the things that they had done, it should make our hair stand up on end and say, Lord, forbid that I should ever be in that position. That I never find myself in that kind of position. It comes to us with a warning. The gospel must never be misunderstood. It must never be misrepresented. Ever. Because it is not our gospel. It's the Lord's. It's His. And it cost much. But when we fall in line with this gospel, we become a blessing to the nations. It's beautiful when you start to see those who do not know the Lord coming to Him and hearing the pure gospel. Not all the things I'm interested in, the gospel. And they realize it. And the joy that they feel when they know that Jesus came and took on human flesh. That he went to the cross. He died on the cross so they could go free. He rose from the dead so that they could have life. And that when life comes to an end, it's not going to be some perchance that maybe they would find their God in a good mood, or that it wasn't the end of all things, but that when they passed on, they would find hope. What joy. They realize. And when they can go and tell this to their family and their friends, the joy that comes with knowing that gospel. And knowing that they have now met God in all His glory. They've met Him and that He actually loves them. Because they have lived life where shreds have been torn off them by whoever in society, that by the time they hear the gospel, they are a mere measure of a human being, that they feel that they are so useless, and that they feel that they are not loved and have no purpose, no direction in life. But the fact that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords of this whole universe would love them. For them, that is such good news. But yet for somebody to stand there in Jerusalem and shout out, "Come help us," because we don't want anybody to hear this message. We'd rather want to kill it. We could become a stumbling block if we don't see the gospel as the blessing. And we ourselves are messengers of that blessing. It's beautiful. It's so beautiful. Ask the worship team to start making their way forward. As the church began to grow from the first century onwards, soon you found that as it moved into various communities, they discovered that the communities were by and large illiterate. They needed somebody to read the scriptures for them. They didn't have the capacity to necessarily read and understand, much so what like you find in Africa, particularly amongst those Muslim imams. They had heard about that there was a thing called the Quran, but didn't even know what was in there. So there were people who learned that there was this thing called the Bible. But in order to understand what the message of salvation was all about, the church began to write creeds and confessions to prevent those who were illiterate from adding and taking away and coming up with their own gospel, to keep them straight in line. That's the gospel. And when you go and share this gospel with anybody, that's it. And so the creeds were used in such a way as to that they had a certain meter to them. They were done with chants, so that you could remember it, almost like nursery rhymes. You can remember them. They're easy to remember, even though most of the nursery rhymes are based on such horrendous histories, but we remember them. And so the illiterate population was able to go out and still present the gospel. In Australia, we're a literate nation. But are we biblically literate or biblically illiterate? Is the church in Australia biblically literate or biblically illiterate? Do we know what's contained in the pages of the Bible? For when you read it, it's the gospel. It's good news. And we are a blessing. It's God's covenant that He has made with us. We are a blessing. And we present that blessing. And that is beautiful. It's a joy. It's a privilege for us to be that blessing and not to be a stumbling block. Let's continue to worship the Lord and give Him glory.